Tonight, we drift in to the gentle telling of Cast Away, a story about time, solitude, and the quiet strength that lives within us all. A peaceful journey through one man's transformation. Let your mind settle as we follow Chuck Noland from his busy life to the stillness of an island, and eventually back to a world that has moved on without him. But before that, my name's Murphy, and I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time of day it is for you. If this brings you calm, don't forget to subscribe. There are so many more peaceful nights ahead. Our story begins in the heart of Memphis, Tennessee, where the morning sun casts long, gentle shadows across the sprawling FedEx headquarters. Here, in this world of packages and precise timing, we meet Chuck Noland. Chuck is a man who lives by the clock, a systems analyst for FedEx, who treats time like a precious resource that must never be wasted. Chuck moves through the busy corridors of the FedEx facility with purpose and energy. He's a tall man with kind eyes and an easy smile, someone who genuinely cares about his work and the people around him. His colleagues respect him because he understands that behind every package is a person waiting, hoping, trusting that their important delivery will arrive exactly when promised. In the main hub, Chuck addresses a group of FedEx employees from around the world. He speaks about the importance of time, how every minute matters in their business. His voice is warm but focused as he explains that time rules over them all. He tells them that they live by the clock, that time is their master, and they must never allow themselves to be late. The workers listen intently, nodding as Chuck emphasizes that a package delayed is a promise broken. The facility hums with quiet efficiency around them. Conveyor belts move packages in smooth, continuous streams. Workers sort mail with practiced ease, their movements calm and rhythmic. Chuck walks among them, checking systems, reviewing schedules, always making sure everything runs like clockwork. This is his world, a place where precision and reliability matter more than anything else. As we watch Chuck throughout his day, we begin to understand that work isn't just what he does. It's who he is. He carries a pager that beeps regularly, pulling his attention away from conversations, meals, and quiet moments. Each beep represents another problem to solve, another schedule to maintain, another deadline to meet. Chuck's office is neat and organized, with charts showing delivery routes and efficiency statistics covering the walls. His desk holds stacks of reports about shipping times and customer satisfaction. He studies these numbers carefully, always looking for ways to make deliveries faster and more reliable. His dedication is complete and unwavering. Even when he's away from the office, Chuck's mind remains focused on work. He thinks about packages moving across the country, about planes taking off and landing on schedule, about drivers making their rounds in cities and small towns. The responsibility weighs on him, but it's a weight he carries gladly because he believes in what he's doing. His colleagues often joke that Chuck has FedEx running through his veins instead of blood. He laughs along with them, but there's truth in their words. Chuck has built his entire identity around being reliable, being on time, being the person others can count on when something absolutely has to get delivered. As Christmas approaches, Chuck takes a brief pause from his demanding schedule to spend time with the people he loves most. He drives through quiet Memphis streets, decorated with twinkling lights and peaceful holiday displays to reach Kelly's family home. Kelly Frears is Chuck's girlfriend, a woman with gentle eyes and a patient heart who has learned to love Chuck despite his obsession with work. Kelly's family has gathered for their traditional Christmas Eve dinner. The house is warm and inviting, filled with the soft glow of Christmas lights and the comfortable sounds of family conversation. The dining room table is set with care, surrounded by people who have known each other for years and share the easy comfort that comes with long familiarity. Chuck sits at the table, trying his best to be present for this special evening. He makes conversation with Kelly's relatives, asking about their lives and sharing stories from his travels. But even here, surrounded by warmth and love, his pager continues to beep. Each time it sounds, Chuck glances at it automatically, his mind briefly shifting to work matters before he forces his attention back to the family around him. Kelly watches him with understanding eyes. She knows that Chuck's work demands so much of him, and she's learned to accept that this is part of who he is. She doesn't complain or ask him to ignore the pages, because she understands how important his job is to him. Instead, she simply enjoys the moments when he's fully present, treasuring the times when his attention belongs completely to her and her family. The dinner continues peacefully, with family members sharing memories and making plans for the new year. Chuck contributes to the conversation, but part of him remains distracted, thinking about the work that waits for him even during this holiday break. After dinner, Chuck and Kelly find a quiet moment together away from the family gathering. They sit in Kelly's childhood bedroom, a space that feels safe and intimate, surrounded by memories of her growing up. The room is softly lit, creating a peaceful atmosphere perfect for sharing gifts and private conversation. Chuck presents Kelly with a small, carefully wrapped box. Inside is a beautiful ring, not an engagement ring, but something precious that shows how much she means to him. Kelly's eyes light up with genuine joy as she examines the gift. She understands that this ring represents Chuck's deep affection for her, even if he's not ready to make the commitment of marriage just yet. Kelly has prepared a gift for Chuck as well. She gives him a pocket watch, an antique timepiece that belonged to her grandfather. The watch is elegant and meaningful, a perfect gift for a man who lives his life by the clock. Chuck is deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the present and the family history it represents. As they sit together examining their gifts, Chuck's pager beeps again. This time the message is urgent. There's a problem with the delivery in Malaysia, and Chuck's expertise is needed immediately. He looks at the pager, then at Kelly, knowing that this page means he'll have to leave right away, even on Christmas Eve. Kelly sees the conflict in his eyes. She knows what the page means before he even tells her. With the patience and understanding that has sustained their relationship, she tells him she knows he has to go. She doesn't make him feel guilty or ask him to stay. Instead, she supports his decision because she understands that this is who Chuck is, and this is what his work demands. Within hours of receiving that urgent page, Chuck finds himself packing quickly for an unexpected trip to Malaysia. He moves through his apartment with practiced efficiency, gathering the clothes and documents he'll need for what should be a short business trip. His movements are calm and methodical, the result of years of last-minute travel for work emergencies. Kelly drives him to the Memphis airport, through quiet streets decorated with Christmas lights. The city looks peaceful and settled, most families safely at home, enjoying their holiday celebrations. Chuck and Kelly don't talk much during the drive, both of them understanding that this interruption is simply part of their life together. At the airport, they share a gentle goodbye. Kelly kisses him softly and tells him to be safe, to come back to her soon. Chuck promises he'll return in just a few days, that this is just a quick trip to solve a problem, and then he'll be home for New Year's Eve. Neither of them knows that this goodbye will stretch into years of separation. Chuck boards the FedEx cargo plane that will take him across the Pacific Ocean. The plane is loaded with packages bound for destinations throughout Asia, each one representing someone's Christmas gift or important delivery. Chuck settles into his seat among the cargo, surrounded by the familiar sight of FedEx boxes and envelopes. The plane is staffed by experienced pilots who know Chuck from his frequent travels. They greet him warmly, joking about having to work on Christmas Eve, but understanding that the packages they're carrying are important to people around the world. Chuck shares their professional attitude, viewing this flight as just another part of doing their job well. As the FedEx cargo plane prepares for takeoff from Memphis, the weather begins to change. Dark clouds gather on the horizon, and the wind picks up, causing small items on the plane to shift and rattle softly. The pilots check their instruments carefully, reviewing weather reports and discussing the safest route across the Pacific. Chuck settles back in his seat, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the cargo plane's engines warming up. He's flown this route many times before, and the routine of air travel has become comfortable and familiar to him. He reviews some work documents as the plane taxis towards the runway, making mental notes about the problems he'll need to solve once he reaches Malaysia. The takeoff is smooth initially, with the plane rising steadily into the evening sky above Memphis. Chuck looks out the small window at the city lights growing smaller below them, thinking about Kelly and her family still gathered around their Christmas dinner table. He feels a small pang of regret about missing the rest of the holiday celebration, but he knows he made the right choice in responding to the work emergency. As they climb higher, the plane enters the storm system that has been developing over the region. The ride becomes bumpier, with the aircraft gently rocking back and forth as it pushes through areas of turbulent air. Chuck notices the change, but isn't concerned. He's experienced rough weather during flights many times before. The pilots maintain their calm professionalism, adjusting their course slightly to find smoother air. They communicate with air traffic control about weather conditions ahead, receiving updates about storm systems they'll encounter during their long flight across the Pacific. Everything seems routine, just another challenging but manageable flight through difficult weather. As the FedEx cargo plane continues its journey across the vast Pacific Ocean, the weather conditions steadily worsen. What began as gentle rocking motion gradually intensifies into something more serious. The plane begins to shake more violently, and items in the cargo hold start to shift with each sudden movement. Chuck notices that the pilots are speaking more urgently to each other, though their voices remain professional and controlled. They're working through their instruments, checking systems, and trying to find a path through the increasingly dangerous weather. The turbulence grows stronger, causing packages to slide across the cargo hold despite being secured with nets and straps. The steady drone of the engines begins to change, developing an irregular rhythm that suggests mechanical problems. Chuck can hear the pilots discussing issues with their instruments, talking about systems that aren't responding normally. The plane lurches suddenly to one side, then the other, as if it's fighting against forces beyond the pilot's control. Through the small cargo hold window, Chuck can see lightning flashing in the distance, illuminating massive storm clouds that seem to stretch endlessly in all directions. The ocean below is invisible in the darkness, existing only as a vast emptiness beneath them. Rain begins to strike the windows with increasing intensity. The pilots work frantically now, their calm voices becoming more strained as they try to regain control of the aircraft. Chuck can hear them calling for emergency assistance, reporting their position and the difficulties they're experiencing. The plane shudders and drops suddenly, causing Chuck's stomach to lurch as they lose altitude rapidly. In the final moments before impact, Chuck realizes that something has gone terribly wrong. The plane is descending too quickly, the engines making sounds that clearly indicate major mechanical failure. The pilots are shouting now, abandoning their professional calm as they struggle with controls that no longer respond properly. Chuck braces himself as best he can, understanding instinctively that they are going to crash. The cargo around him shifts violently as the plane tilts at an impossible angle. Packages break free from their restraints and tumble through the cargo hold, creating a chaos of moving boxes and scattered contents. The impact with the ocean comes suddenly and with tremendous force. The plane hits the water and immediately begins breaking apart, metal screaming as the fuselage splits under the pressure. Cold Pacific water rushes into the cargo hold with frightening speed, carrying debris and packages in its powerful current. Chuck finds himself underwater, disoriented and struggling to understand which direction leads to the surface. The water is shockingly cold and completely dark. Pieces of the plane sink around him, creating dangerous obstacles as he tries to swim upward toward what he hopes is air and safety. His lungs burn with the need for oxygen as he fights his way through the wreckage-filled water. Heavy cargo sinks past him, disappearing into the dark depths below. Chuck kicks desperately, his clothes and shoes making swimming difficult, but somehow he manages to break through to the surface. When Chuck finally surfaces, gasping and choking on salt water, he finds himself in the middle of a vast, dark ocean. Pieces of the plane float around him, along with scattered packages and debris from the cargo hold. The main wreckage of the aircraft is already sinking, disappearing beneath the waves with a horrible, gurgling sound. Chuck treads water frantically, looking around for anything that might help him survive. The storm that caused the crash is still raging above him, with rain pelting down and waves tossing him up and down like a cork. Lightning continues to flash in the distance, providing brief moments of illumination that show him the empty ocean stretching in all directions. Among the floating debris, Chuck notices a life raft that deployed automatically when the plane hit the water. These bright orange rafts offer the only hope of survival in the vast ocean. Chuck swims desperately towards the nearest raft, knowing that his strength won't last long in the cold water. The waves make reaching the life raft incredibly difficult. Just when Chuck thinks he's close enough to grab the side, another wave pushes him away. He has to swim harder, using every bit of his remaining energy to fight against the ocean's power. Finally, he manages to pull himself up and into the relative safety of the life raft. The raft rocks violently on the storm-tossed ocean, but it provides crucial protection from the waves that would otherwise overwhelm them in the water. He checks the raft's emergency supplies, finding basic survival equipment including flares, a first aid kit, and some emergency water and food rations. These supplies offer hope, but he understands that he's completely alone in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Hours pass slowly as the raft drifts on the ocean swells. After drifting for hours, Chuck awakens to find himself alone on the life raft. In the distance, Chuck spots something that fills him with desperate hope. Land. A small island rises from the ocean, covered with green vegetation and surrounded by a coral reef. It's not large, but it represents the possibility of survival. a place where he can get out of the life raft and onto solid ground. The ocean current carries Chuck's raft towards the island, but getting safely to shore proves more challenging than he expected. The coral reef that surrounds the island creates dangerous breaking waves that threaten to destroy the raft and injure him badly. Chuck has to time his approach carefully, waiting for the right moment to paddle through the reef. When a large wave finally carries him over the coral, Chuck finds himself in the shallow lagoon that surrounds the island. The water here is calmer, a beautiful turquoise color that would be breathtaking under different circumstances. Chuck paddles weakly towards the beach, exhausted from his ordeal in the ocean, but driven by the desperate need to reach safety. The life raft finally grounds itself on the sandy beach, and Chuck crawls out onto dry land for the first time since the plane crash. He collapses on the warm sand, overwhelmed with relief and exhaustion. His clothes are torn and salt-stained, his body aching from days of exposure to sun and salt water. But he's alive and on solid ground. After resting on the beach for several hours, Chuck slowly begins to explore his new surroundings. The island is small, but substantial, covered with thick tropical vegetation and surrounded by the coral reef that both protected and nearly destroyed him during his approach. Palm trees line the beach, their fronds rustling gently in the ocean breeze. Chuck walks slowly along the shoreline, his legs still unsteady after days on the life raft. The beach is made of white coral sand, mixed with small pieces of volcanic rock, evidence that this island was formed by underwater volcanic activity long ago. Crabs scurry away from his feet as he walks, disappearing into holes in the sand or hiding among the rocks. The island appears to be uninhabited, with no signs of human presence anywhere along the beach. Chuck calls out several times, hoping that perhaps other people live here, or that other survivors from his plane might have washed ashore. But only his own voice echoes back from the jungle. The silence is both peaceful and terrifying. From the beach, Chuck can see that the island has some elevation toward its center, with hills covered in dense tropical forest. He spots coconut palms, which could provide both food and fresh water if he can figure out how to access them. Other vegetation includes various tropical plants and trees that he doesn't recognize, but hopes might be useful for survival. Chuck realizes that he needs to understand the size and resources of his new home. He begins walking around the perimeter of the island, staying close to the beach where the walking is easier. The complete circuit takes him several hours, confirming that this is indeed a small island, probably no more than a few miles across at its widest point. As Chuck continues his exploration, he discovers that the island has several distinct areas that could be useful for survival. Near the beach where he landed, there's a grove of coconut palms that could provide food and drink. Behind this, the land rises into dense jungle filled with various plants and trees. Chuck ventures carefully into the edge of the jungle, pushing through thick vegetation and climbing over fallen logs. The air here is humid and filled with the sounds of insects and small animals moving through the undergrowth. Shafts of sunlight filter down through the dense canopy, creating a green, cathedral-like atmosphere. He discovers a small freshwater stream that runs from the island's interior down towards the ocean. The water appears clean and clear, flowing over smooth rocks and collecting in small pools along its path. Chuck kneels beside the stream and drinks deeply, realizing how desperately thirsty he had become during his time on the life raft. Near the stream, Chuck finds evidence of the island's wildlife. Bird droppings suggest that various species nest in the trees above, and he spots small lizards sunning themselves on rocks. He doesn't see any large animals, which is both reassuring and disappointing. There will be no dangerous predators to worry about, but also no large sources of meat for food. Chuck identifies several areas that could serve as potential shelter sites. A grove of trees near the stream would provide shade and access to fresh water. Higher up the beach, above the high tide line, there are large rocks and fallen trees that could form the foundation for a more permanent shelter. As Chuck explores the beach more thoroughly, he begins to notice familiar objects washing up on the shore. FedEx packages from the crashed plane are arriving with each tide, carried by the ocean currents from the crash site. These packages represent a potential treasure trove of useful items for survival. Chuck feels a mixture of excitement and professional responsibility as he gathers the packages. Even in his desperate situation, he maintains respect for the contents, understanding that each package represents someone's important delivery. He carefully collects each one, carrying them to a safe spot above the high tide line. The packages vary in size and weight, wrapped in FedEx's familiar packaging and labeled with addresses from around the world. Some are damaged from their time in the ocean, with water having seeped through the wrapping to potentially damage the contents. Others appear to be in relatively good condition, their waterproof packaging having protected them during their underwater journey. Chuck faces a moral dilemma as he considers whether to open the packages. His professional ethics tell him that these deliveries belong to other people and should remain unopened. But his survival situation demands that he use whatever resources are available to stay alive. He decides to wait before opening any packages, hoping that rescue might come soon. As more packages continue to wash ashore over the following days, Chuck organizes them carefully. He sorts them by size and apparent contents, making mental notes about which ones might contain items useful for survival. Some packages feel like they contain clothing, others seem to hold electronics or books, and a few contain mysterious contents that he can only guess at. Chuck's first priority, after establishing basic shelter and water, is to create signals that might attract the attention of rescue aircraft or ships. He knows that search teams will be looking for the crashed plane, and he needs to make his presence on the island as visible as possible from the air and sea. Using rocks and pieces of coral from the beach, Chuck begins constructing a large "Help" sign in the sand above the high tide line. He makes the letters as large as possible, hoping they'll be visible to aircraft flying overhead. The work is exhausting under the hot tropical sun, but Chuck persists, knowing that this signal could mean the difference between rescue and permanent isolation. Chuck also gathers driftwood and other debris to build signal fires at strategic points around the island. He places these potential fires on high ground and near the beach, where they would be most visible. However, he quickly realizes that starting a fire will be much more difficult than he anticipated, having no matches or lighter. During the day, Chuck uses a mirror-like piece of metal from the plane wreckage to create flashing signals, hoping to reflect sunlight toward any aircraft that might be searching for survivors. He practices aiming the reflected light towards the horizon, ready to signal immediately if he spots any planes or helicopters. At night, Chuck keeps watch for any lights on the horizon that might indicate ships passing near the island. The ocean stretches endlessly in all directions, seemingly empty of any human presence. The stars above are brilliant in the clear tropical sky, more vivid than Chuck has ever seen them, but they offer no hope of rescue. Despite his efforts, no rescue comes. Days pass without any sign of search aircraft or ships. Chuck begins to realize that he may be completely outside the search area, that rescue teams might be looking in entirely different parts of the ocean. The possibility of long-term survival on the island becomes increasingly real. After several days without any sign of rescue, Chuck finally decides that survival must take priority over his professional ethics regarding the packages. He begins opening them carefully, apologizing aloud to the unknown recipients as he unwraps their belongings. The first package Chuck opens contains ice skates, elegant figure skates that were clearly expensive and meant as a special gift for someone. Chuck examines them carefully, thinking about their potential uses. The blades are sharp and could serve as cutting tools, while the leather boots might provide materials for other survival needs. Another package contains a volleyball, bright white with red accents, along with some other sporting goods. Chuck initially dismisses the volleyball as useless for survival, but something about its simple, friendly appearance appeals to him. He sets it aside, thinking he might find a use for it later. One package yields a water-stained dress, elegant and formal, clearly meant for a special occasion. Though the dress itself isn't useful for Chuck's immediate survival needs, the fabric could potentially be used for rope, bandages, or other purposes. Chuck feels guilty as he examines the ruined garment, thinking about the woman who will never receive this special gift. Several packages contain various household items, electronics damaged beyond repair by salt water, and books whose pages have been destroyed by moisture. Chuck sorts through everything carefully, keeping items that might be useful and setting aside things that have no survival value. The most valuable discovery is a package containing a knife and some basic tools. Though they're not designed for survival situations, they're infinitely better than trying to work with just his hands and pieces of coral. Chuck feels a surge of hope as he examines these tools, knowing they'll make many survival tasks easier. Chuck understands that fire is essential for survival, needed for cooking food, purifying water, providing warmth during cool nights, and creating smoke signals for rescue. However, starting a fire without matches, a lighter, or other modern conveniences proves to be one of his most frustrating challenges. Chuck tries various methods he half remembers from movies and survival shows. He attempts to create friction fires using pieces of wood, rubbing them together rapidly in hopes of generating enough heat to create sparks. His hands become raw and blistered from the effort, but he produces only small amounts of warm wood dust, never enough heat to actually ignite anything. He experiments with using the ice skate blades to strike sparks from rocks, hoping to find stones that will produce the kind of sparks that could ignite tinder. Chuck searches the beach and jungle for the right types of rock, testing different combinations and techniques. Occasionally he manages to create small sparks, but they die out immediately without catching any of his carefully prepared tinder. Chuck tries focusing sunlight through pieces of clear plastic and glass found among the wreckage, attempting to concentrate the sun's rays enough to start a fire. He spends hours adjusting angles and distances, watching hopefully as the focused light creates small hot spots on his tinder materials. The attempts come frustratingly close to success, but never quite achieve the sustained heat needed for ignition. Days pass with Chuck making repeated attempts at fire starting, each failure adding to his growing frustration and desperation. He begins to realize that fire making is a genuine skill that requires knowledge and practice he simply doesn't possess. The failure to create fire affects his ability to cook food, purify questionable water sources, and stay warm during the cool nights. In his growing frustration with the fire-starting attempts, Chuck decides to try a more aggressive approach, using one of the ice skate blades as a tool for creating sparks. He works frantically, striking the metal blade against various rocks with increasing force, desperate to generate the sparks he needs to finally start a fire. During one particularly vigorous attempt, Chuck loses control of the ice skate, and the sharp blade cuts deeply into his hand. The wound is immediate and severe, blood flowing freely from the gash in his palm. Chuck cries out in pain and shock, dropping the ice skate and clutching his injured hand against his chest. The cut is deeper than Chuck initially realizes, and the blood loss is concerning. He tries to stop the bleeding by applying pressure with torn pieces of cloth from the packages, but the wound continues to seep blood through his makeshift bandages. The pain is intense, and Chuck realizes he's also at risk of infection in the tropical environment. Chuck's injury forces him to take a break from his fire-starting efforts and focus on basic first aid. He cleans the wound as best he can with fresh water from the stream, though he knows this isn't the same as having proper antiseptic. He creates a more effective bandage using materials from the packages, trying to keep the wound clean and protected. The accident serves as a harsh reminder of how dangerous his situation really is. A serious injury on the island could be fatal, with no medical help available and no way to get proper treatment. Chuck realizes he needs to be much more careful with tools and take fewer risks, even when frustration drives him to desperate measures. After days of failed attempts and the setback of his injury, Chuck approaches the fire-making challenge with renewed determination and a more systematic method. He carefully prepares everything he needs before beginning: dry tinder made from coconut fiber, small twigs and bark arranged in precise order, and larger pieces of wood ready to add once flames begin. Chuck returns to the friction method, but this time he's more patient and methodical. He selects his wood more carefully, choosing pieces that seem most likely to generate sustained heat. He works steadily, but not frantically, maintaining consistent pressure and rhythm rather than trying to rush the process. Hours pass with Chuck working patiently at his fire-making attempt. His hands are sore, and his arms ache from the repetitive motion, but he forces himself to continue with steady determination. Gradually, he begins to see small wisps of smoke rising from his tinder, evidence that he's finally generating real heat. When the first tiny flame finally appears among his carefully prepared tinder, Chuck feels a rush of triumph and relief unlike anything he's ever experienced. He gently nurtures the small flame, feeding it with increasingly larger pieces of fuel, watching as it grows from a tiny flicker into a genuine fire. The fire transforms Chuck's situation immediately. He has light and warmth as evening approaches, the ability to cook food and purify water, and a tool for creating smoke signals during the day. More importantly, the fire represents his first major victory over the challenges of survival, proof that he can adapt and learn the skills he needs to stay alive on the island. As the days stretch into weeks, Chuck begins to feel the psychological weight of complete isolation. The silence of the island, broken only by natural sounds of wind and waves, becomes oppressive. The absence of human conversation and companionship starts to affect his mental state in ways he hadn't anticipated. One evening, as Chuck sits by his fire, examining his collection of items from the packages, his attention turns to the volleyball he had set aside earlier. The ball's simple design includes a printed face, the Wilson brand logo, with two curved lines that, in the flickering firelight, seem almost like a smile. Chuck finds himself staring at this unintentional face, his mind beginning to see human features in the abstract design. In a moment of desperate loneliness, Chuck decides to enhance the volleyball's facial appearance. Using his own blood from a fresh cut on his hand, he creates more defined features, adding details that make the ball look more like an actual face. He gives the volleyball eyes, a nose, and a mouth, transforming it from a simple sporting good into something that resembles a companion. Chuck names the volleyball Wilson, after the brand name printed on its surface. He begins talking to Wilson, at first feeling foolish, but gradually becoming more comfortable with the one-sided conversations. Wilson becomes the recipient of Chuck's thoughts, fears, and daily experiences, a silent listener who provides psychological comfort in the endless isolation. As time passes, Wilson becomes increasingly important to Chuck's mental stability. Chuck shares his meals with Wilson, positioning the volleyball nearby during tasks, and talking through problems and decisions as if Wilson were offering advice. The volleyball provides the illusion of companionship that helps Chuck maintain his sanity in the face of crushing loneliness. As weeks turn to months on the island, Chuck's physical appearance begins to change dramatically. Without access to shaving equipment, his beard grows long and wild, becoming matted with salt from the ocean air and stained from his various survival activities. The beard makes him look increasingly primitive and disconnected from his former civilization. Chuck's body weight drops significantly as he adapts to the limited food sources available on the island. His diet consists mainly of coconuts, fish he occasionally manages to catch, and various edible plants he's identified through careful experimentation. The physical demands of survival activities, combined with the restricted calorie intake, cause his body to become lean and muscular in ways that reflect his new lifestyle. His clothes, already damaged during the plane crash and subsequent survival efforts, become increasingly tattered and worn. Chuck patches them as best he can using materials from the packages, but the tropical environment and constant use take their toll. Eventually, his clothing becomes more of a collection of rags held together by improvised repairs. Chuck's hands become calloused and scarred from the constant manual work required for survival. His skin is deeply tanned from constant exposure to the tropical sun, and his hair becomes bleached and wild from salt water and sun. These physical changes reflect his transformation from a civilized businessman into someone adapted for primitive survival. The changes in Chuck's appearance serve as a visible marker of how much time has passed and how completely his life has changed. When he catches glimpses of his reflection in pools of water, he sometimes barely recognizes himself, seeing a wild-looking castaway instead of the well-groomed FedEx executive he used to be. Chuck gradually develops more sophisticated methods for obtaining food and fresh water as his survival skills improve through necessity and experimentation. His early attempts at fishing were clumsy and largely unsuccessful, but persistent effort and observation of the island's marine life teach him better techniques. Using materials from the packages and debris from the plane, Chuck constructs fishing spears and improvised hooks. He learns to read the water around the coral reef, identifying areas where fish are likely to gather and understanding the best times of day for fishing. His success rate improves gradually, providing him with crucial protein to supplement his diet of coconuts and edible plants. Chuck discovers that he can catch fish more effectively by creating fish traps using woven materials and strategic placement near the reef. These passive fishing methods allow him to continue other survival activities while still working to secure food. He becomes skilled at identifying which types of fish are safe to eat and how to prepare them properly. For fresh water, Chuck develops a system for collecting and storing rainwater using containers salvaged from the packages and improvised catchment surfaces made from plane debris. He learns to recognize weather patterns that indicate approaching rain and positions his collection system accordingly. Chuck also discovers methods for obtaining water from coconuts and identifies other plants on the island that can provide moisture. He creates a small storage system for fresh water, using various containers to maintain a reserve for times when rain is scarce. These water management skills become crucial for his long-term survival. As Chuck accepts that his stay on the island may be extended, he begins constructing a more permanent and comfortable shelter to replace the basic lean-to he built during his first days. His improved shelter reflects both his growing survival skills and his acceptance of the island as a long-term home. Chuck selects a location that provides protection from storms, access to fresh water, and a good view of the ocean for watching for potential rescue. He uses large pieces of debris from the plane as the foundation and framework, combining them with materials he's gathered from around the island. The shelter's walls are constructed from woven palm fronds and other vegetation, creating barriers that provide privacy and protection from wind and rain. Chuck learns to weave these materials together using techniques he develops through trial and error, creating surprisingly effective panels that can be repaired and replaced as needed. For the roof, Chuck uses a combination of metal sheeting from the plane wreckage and layers of palm fronds arranged to shed rainwater effectively. He creates gutters and channels to direct rainwater into his collection containers, making his shelter serve multiple survival functions simultaneously. Inside the shelter, Chuck creates designated areas for different activities. He has a sleeping area lined with soft materials salvaged from packages, a workspace where he can repair tools and prepare food, and storage areas for his various survival supplies. The shelter becomes not just protection from the elements, but a psychological home that provides comfort and routine. Chuck takes pride in his shelter construction, viewing it as evidence of his adaptation and survival skills. He continues to improve and expand the structure over time, adding features like a covered cooking area and better ventilation. The shelter represents his acceptance that survival requires long-term planning and permanent solutions. As days blur into months, Chuck develops a system for tracking the passage of time using a large rock near his shelter. Each day, he makes a small mark on the rock's surface, creating a primitive calendar that helps him maintain some connection to the concept of time and date. The daily ritual of marking time becomes an important psychological anchor for Chuck. Each morning, after tending to his fire and checking his water supplies, he makes his mark on the rock and mentally calculates how long he's been on the island. This routine provides structure to his days and helps prevent the complete loss of temporal awareness that could result from the island's timeless environment. Chuck creates different types of marks to distinguish between regular days, weeks, and months, developing his own system of notation that makes sense to him. He occasionally talks to Wilson about significant dates, mentioning Kelly's birthday, Christmas, and other meaningful times from his former life. As the marks accumulate on the rock, they become a visual representation of Chuck's endurance and survival. Hundreds of small scratches and lines cover the rock's surface, each one representing a day he's managed to stay alive despite the challenges of island life. The growing collection of marks also serves as a sobering reminder of how much time has passed and how long he's been separated from civilization. The time-marking ritual also helps Chuck maintain hope for rescue. He often tells Wilson that surely someone will find them soon, that the accumulating marks on the rock represent time getting closer to rescue rather than time slipping away. This optimistic interpretation helps Chuck maintain the mental strength needed for long-term survival. After many months on the island, Chuck decides that waiting for rescue may not be enough. He begins planning an escape attempt, reasoning that if he can reach shipping lanes or get closer to populated islands, he might have a better chance of being found by passing vessels. Chuck begins constructing a raft using logs, debris from the plane, and materials he's gathered around the island. The project requires weeks of work, lashing pieces together with rope made from plant fibers and testing different designs for stability and buoyancy. He involves Wilson in the planning process, discussing navigation strategies and supply requirements. The raft construction becomes Chuck's primary focus, representing hope for reunion with Kelly and return to civilization. He works on it methodically, testing each component and making improvements based on his observations of how different materials perform in the water. Chuck creates a small sail using fabric from the packages and develops a rudimentary steering system. When Chuck finally attempts to launch his raft and escape the island, the venture quickly turns dangerous. The coral reef that surrounds the island creates powerful currents and breaking waves that threaten to destroy the raft and drown Chuck in the process. The ocean conditions are far more challenging than they appeared from the safety of the beach. Chuck struggles desperately to control the raft as waves crash over it and threaten to break it apart. The makeshift construction begins to fail under the stress of the rough water, and Chuck realizes he's in serious danger of drowning if he continues. Reluctantly, he abandons the escape attempt and manages to get himself and Wilson back to shore, exhausted and defeated by his first attempt to leave the island. As Chuck's time on the island extends beyond a year, his body begins to show the effects of inadequate nutrition and the lack of proper dental care. One of his teeth becomes infected, causing intense pain that interferes with his ability to eat, sleep, and maintain his daily survival routines. The tooth pain grows progressively worse over several days, becoming a constant, throbbing agony that Chuck cannot ignore or treat effectively. He tries various remedies using plants from the island, rinsing with salt water and applying pressure to relieve the pain, but nothing provides lasting relief from the infection. Chuck realizes that the infected tooth poses a serious threat to his health and survival. The infection could spread, potentially becoming life-threatening without proper medical treatment. With no dentist available and no modern medical supplies, Chuck faces the terrifying prospect of having to remove the tooth himself. Using tools improvised from his survival supplies, Chuck performs primitive dental surgery on himself, extracting the infected tooth in an agonizing procedure that tests his physical and mental limits. The experience is excruciating, but Chuck manages to complete the extraction and clean the wound as best he can with the limited resources available. The tooth extraction represents another milestone in Chuck's transformation from civilized man to primitive survivor. He's now performed medical procedures on himself that would have been unthinkable in his former life, demonstrating the lengths to which desperation and necessity can drive human adaptation. Chuck shows the extracted tooth to Wilson, treating his volleyball companion as a witness to his ordeal and survival. After more than 3 years on the island, Chuck makes a discovery that will change everything. While exploring a part of the beach he doesn't visit often, he finds a large piece of debris that has recently washed ashore. It's a door from an airplane lavatory, made of lightweight but sturdy materials, and designed to be both waterproof and buoyant. Chuck examines the toilet door carefully, immediately recognizing its potential as a sailing component for a new escape attempt. Unlike the crude materials he used for his previous raft, this door is professionally manufactured, designed to withstand pressure and moisture. Its smooth surface and aerodynamic shape make it ideal for use as a sail. The discovery fills Chuck with renewed hope and excitement. He's learned from his previous failed escape attempt, and now has access to a component that could make the crucial difference between success and failure. Chuck discusses the find with Wilson, explaining how this door could provide the sailing power needed to carry them beyond the dangerous coral reef. Chuck begins immediately planning a new escape attempt, this time incorporating the toilet door as the centerpiece of his design. He studies the ocean conditions more carefully than before, observing wind patterns and wave behavior to identify the optimal time for departure. The door represents not just a piece of equipment, but a symbol of renewed hope for rescue and return to civilization. The toilet door also serves as a psychological boost for Chuck after years of gradual despair. Its arrival feels almost like a gift from fate, arriving at a time when Chuck had begun to accept that he might spend the rest of his life on the island. The door rekindles his determination to escape and reunite with Kelly, no matter how difficult or dangerous the attempt might be. Chuck begins construction of a new, more sophisticated raft that incorporates everything he's learned from his years of survival experience and his previous failed escape attempt. This time, he approaches the project with the patience and skill that come from his years of island life, taking time to plan each component carefully. The new raft design uses the toilet door as a sail, positioned to catch wind effectively, while maintaining the stability needed to navigate through the dangerous waters around the coral reef. Chuck creates a mast using a strong piece of driftwood and develops a rigging system that allows him to control the sail's position and angle. Chuck constructs the raft's base using the most buoyant and durable materials he's collected over the years, lashing them together with improved rope-making techniques he's developed through experience. The design is more compact and maneuverable than his previous attempt, better suited for one person to handle alone in challenging conditions. The construction process takes many weeks, with Chuck working methodically on each component while continuing his daily survival routines. He tests individual elements in shallow water, making improvements and adjustments based on their performance. Wilson serves as Chuck's constant companion during the construction, positioned nearby as Chuck explains each step of the building process. Chuck also prepares supplies for the voyage, gathering coconuts for food and water, creating containers for additional fresh water storage, and selecting tools and materials that might be useful once he reaches civilization. He approaches this escape attempt with much more thorough preparation than his first desperate try years earlier. Drawing on his years of observation and his background in logistics and systems analysis, Chuck develops a sophisticated plan for using ocean currents and wind patterns to carry his raft away from the island and toward shipping lanes where he might encounter rescue vessels. Chuck has spent countless hours watching the ocean from his island, noting how debris moves with the tides and currents, observing weather patterns, and learning to read the signs that indicate changing conditions. This accumulated knowledge forms the foundation of his escape strategy, replacing the desperate improvisation of his earlier attempt. He identifies specific seasonal conditions that should provide the best combination of favorable winds and currents for his journey. Chuck waits patiently for these conditions to develop, resisting the temptation to launch immediately, and instead biding his time until the ocean offers the best possible chance for success. Chuck creates a mental map of his planned route, estimating distances and travel times based on his observations of how objects move on the ocean currents. He knows that once he leaves the island, he'll be committed to the journey with no possibility of return, so the planning must be as accurate as possible. The escape plan also includes contingencies for various scenarios, from equipment failure to changes in weather conditions. Chuck discusses these plans extensively with Wilson, working through different possibilities and ensuring that he's prepared for the challenges that await them on the open ocean. On his final morning on the island, Chuck performs a ritual farewell to the place that has been his home for over 4 years. He visits all the significant locations, his shelter, the freshwater stream, the fishing spots that have provided sustenance, and the rock where he's marked the passage of time with hundreds of small scratches. Chuck speaks aloud about his memories of island life, acknowledging both the hardships and the strange sense of peace he's sometimes found in the isolation. He's become a different person during his time here, transformed from a time-obsessed executive into someone who understands survival, patience, and the fundamental requirements for staying alive. The goodbye to Wilson is particularly emotional, as Chuck prepares his volleyball companion for the ocean journey ahead. He secures Wilson carefully on the raft, ensuring that his friend will be safe during the voyage. Chuck promises Wilson that they'll soon be rescued and return to civilization together, that their long isolation is finally coming to an end. Chuck takes one final look at his shelter and the various survival systems he's created over the years. These structures represent his adaptation and ingenuity, proof that he's learned to thrive in an environment completely different from his former life. Leaving them behind feels like abandoning a part of himself that he's discovered during his island years. As Chuck prepares to launch the raft, he feels a mixture of excitement, fear, and sadness. The island has been both prison and home, the site of incredible hardship and unexpected personal growth. Leaving represents hope for rescue and reunion with Kelly, but also the end of a chapter of his life that has changed him in fundamental ways. Chuck launches his new raft in the early morning, when wind and current conditions are optimal, according to his careful observations. The departure is much more controlled than his previous attempt, with Chuck using his years of experience to navigate safely through the coral reef that had nearly killed him before. The toilet door sail catches the wind effectively, providing propulsion that carries the raft steadily away from the island and into the vast Pacific Ocean. Chuck manages the sail carefully, adjusting its angle and position to maintain course while avoiding the dangerous overpowering that could capsize the raft. As the island grows smaller behind him, Chuck feels a profound mixture of emotions. Relief at finally escaping combines with anxiety about the unknown dangers that await in the open ocean. He talks to Wilson about their progress, maintaining the conversational routine that has sustained him through years of isolation. The raft performs better than Chuck had dared to hope, riding the ocean swells smoothly and maintaining structural integrity under the stress of wind and waves. His improved construction techniques and better materials make this voyage feel genuinely hopeful, rather than desperately suicidal, like his previous attempt. Chuck settles into the rhythm of ocean travel, managing his water and food supplies carefully while maintaining course toward what he hopes are shipping lanes where rescue vessels might find them. The vast emptiness of the Pacific stretches in all directions, but Chuck faces it with the confidence and skills developed through his years of survival experience. After several days of successful sailing, Chuck encounters a severe storm that tests both his seamanship and the structural limits of his improvised raft. The weather develops quickly, transforming from manageable sailing conditions into a life-threatening situation with towering waves and fierce winds. Chuck struggles to maintain control of the raft as waves crash over it and threaten to break it apart. The toilet door sail, which has performed so well, becomes dangerous in the high winds, threatening to overturn the raft if Chuck can't manage it properly. He works desperately to adjust the rigging and keep the raft stable. During the height of the storm, a massive wave strikes the raft with tremendous force, washing over Chuck and threatening to sweep away everything that isn't securely fastened. In the chaos of wind and water, Chuck realizes with horror that Wilson has been torn from his secure position and is floating away in the turbulent sea. Chuck immediately abandons his efforts to control the raft and dives into the storm-tossed ocean, swimming desperately toward Wilson as his companion is carried away by the powerful current. The volleyball bobs on the waves just out of reach, seemingly so close, but impossible to catch in the dangerous conditions. The ocean's power overwhelms Chuck's efforts to reach Wilson, and he's forced to choose between continuing the hopeless pursuit and saving himself by returning to the raft. The decision tears at him emotionally, but survival instinct forces him back to the raft as Wilson disappears into the storm, lost forever in the vast Pacific. Chuck's loss of Wilson represents far more than losing a piece of equipment. It's the loss of his closest companion and the psychological anchor that has kept him sane through years of isolation. As he watches Wilson disappear into the storm-darkened ocean, Chuck breaks down completely, sobbing with a grief that encompasses years of suppressed emotion. The volleyball had been Chuck's confidant, his audience, his friend during the loneliest period of his life. Wilson represented continuity with his island existence and hope for sharing his rescue with someone who understood what he'd endured. Losing Wilson feels like losing a part of his own identity and survival story. Chuck calls out desperately for Wilson even as the volleyball disappears beyond hope of recovery. His cries are lost in the wind and rain of the storm, but he continues shouting Wilson's name as if his voice alone could bring back his companion. The futility of the situation only adds to his emotional devastation. The grief Chuck experiences is profound and overwhelming, representing not just the loss of Wilson, but also the accumulated stress and loneliness of his entire island experience. He allows himself to cry fully for the first time since the plane crash, releasing emotions he's suppressed in the name of survival and hope. Eventually, Chuck's survival instincts reassert themselves, and he focuses on managing the raft through the remainder of the storm. But Wilson's absence creates a profound emptiness that changes the entire nature of his escape attempt. Chuck must now face the ocean and potential rescue completely alone, without the psychological comfort that Wilson provided. After drifting alone on the ocean for several more days, weak from exposure and running low on fresh water, Chuck spots something on the horizon that fills him with desperate hope. A large cargo ship heading in his direction. He uses every bit of his remaining strength to signal the vessel, waving his makeshift sail and shouting, even though he knows his voice can't carry across the water. The ship's crew spots Chuck's small raft and the frantic signals he's making. They alter course to investigate, and as they draw closer, the crew members realize they've found a survivor in dire need of rescue. The ship slows and carefully maneuvers alongside Chuck's raft, which looks pitifully small next to the massive cargo vessel. Crew members lower ropes and life preservers to Chuck, who has barely enough strength left to secure himself for the rescue. The sailors pull him aboard with gentle efficiency, immediately recognizing that he's been at sea for an extended period and needs medical attention. Chuck collapses on the deck, overwhelmed by the reality that his ordeal is finally over. The ship's crew provides Chuck with fresh water, food, and medical care, while radiating amazement at his survival story. They examine his makeshift raft with respect and admiration, understanding that his escape from whatever situation he'd been in required tremendous skill and determination. Chuck tells them briefly about the plane crash and the island, but he's too exhausted for detailed explanations. As the cargo ship resumes course toward its destination, Chuck finally allows himself to believe that he's truly been rescued. The solid deck beneath his feet, the kindness of the crew, and the promise of return to civilization feel almost dreamlike after his years of isolation. He's survived the unthinkable and is finally going home. The cargo ship delivers Chuck to a port where FedEx representatives and medical personnel are waiting to assist with his return to Memphis. News of his rescue has preceded his arrival, and Chuck finds himself the center of intense media attention and public fascination with his survival story. Chuck's physical appearance shocks everyone who knew him before the crash. His long beard, deeply tanned and weathered skin, lean frame, and primitive clothing make him look like a different person entirely. The transformation from well-groomed executive to wild-looking castaway is so complete that some people have difficulty recognizing him. Medical examinations reveal that Chuck is remarkably healthy, considering his ordeal, though he's lost significant weight and shows signs of malnutrition and dental problems. His body bears the scars and calluses of years of manual survival work, and his hands are permanently changed from the constant use of primitive tools. Chuck struggles with the overwhelming sensory experience of returning to modern civilization. The noise of traffic, the crowds of people, the artificial lighting, and the constant electronic sounds create a jarring contrast to the natural quiet of island life. Simple things like electric lights, running water, and air conditioning feel almost magical after years without them. The process of reintegration begins immediately, with counselors and specialists helping Chuck readjust to social interaction and modern technology. However, Chuck finds that part of him remains on the island, that his years of solitude have changed him in ways that can't be easily reversed by simply returning to his old environment. FedEx organizes a modest welcome ceremony for Chuck, celebrating his survival and acknowledging his dedication to the company, even during his ordeal. Colleagues who worked with Chuck before his disappearance gather to welcome him back, though many are struck by how much he's changed during his time away. The reception is kept deliberately low-key to avoid overwhelming Chuck with too much social stimulation too quickly. His former co-workers share stories about the search efforts that followed his disappearance and express their amazement at his survival against impossible odds. Chuck listens politely, but seems somewhat detached from their enthusiasm. Chuck learns about changes that have occurred at FedEx during his absence, new policies and procedures, technological advances, and personnel changes. The company has continued to evolve and grow while he was frozen in time on the island. creating a sense of disconnect between his memories of his former workplace and its current reality. During the reception, Chuck is presented with items that were found in his office and stored during his absence, personal belongings that now seem to belong to a different person entirely. Looking at photos and mementos from his previous life, Chuck feels like he's examining artifacts from someone else's existence. The ceremony concludes with expressions of support for Chuck's recovery and reintegration, along with assurances that FedEx will provide whatever assistance he needs. However, Chuck seems to understand that his relationship with his former career will never be the same, that the man who was so completely dedicated to precise scheduling and efficient delivery systems died somewhere on that island. The most difficult part of Chuck's return to civilization comes when he learns about Kelly's life during his absence. In the 4 years since his disappearance, Kelly has moved on with her life, eventually accepting that Chuck was gone forever and finding love with someone else. She's now married and has a young daughter. Chuck receives this news with the quiet resignation of someone who has learned to accept harsh realities. His years on the island taught him that hoping for things beyond his control was a luxury he couldn't afford, and he applies this hard-earned wisdom to the situation with Kelly. He understands that she couldn't wait indefinitely for someone who might never return. The knowledge that Kelly has built a new life during his absence brings Chuck both sadness and a strange sense of relief. He's spent years on the island, dreaming of reunion with her, using thoughts of Kelly as motivation to survive and escape. Learning that she's happy and settled provides closure to that chapter of his survival story. Chuck makes no immediate attempt to contact Kelly, recognizing that his sudden return from the dead would be enormously disruptive to a new family life. Instead, he focuses on understanding and accepting the reality of the situation, just as he learned to accept the realities of island survival when circumstances were beyond his control. The loss of his imagined future with Kelly represents another death of his former life, another aspect of his pre-crash existence that can never be recovered. Chuck begins to understand that survival isn't just about staying alive physically, but also about accepting the loss of the life he used to have and finding ways to build something new from what remains. Despite his initial restraint, Chuck eventually decides that he needs to see Kelly, to have closure on the relationship that sustained him emotionally during his years of isolation. He contacts her carefully, through mutual friends, to arrange a meeting that won't disrupt her family life, but will allow them to speak privately. They meet at a quiet restaurant, a neutral location where they can talk without the pressure of being in either of their homes. Kelly arrives first, nervous and emotional about seeing the man she mourned as dead for 4 years. When Chuck enters, she barely recognizes the transformed man he's become. Their conversation is gentle and filled with the weight of years and loss. Kelly tells Chuck about her grief after his disappearance, about the search efforts, about slowly accepting that he was gone forever. She explains her new marriage and daughter, emphasizing that she's happy, but that she never forgot Chuck or stopped caring about him. Chuck listens to Kelly's story with the patience he learned on the island, understanding that her moving on was not a betrayal, but a natural part of life, continuing in his absence. He tells her briefly about his survival, focusing not on the hardships, but on his gradual acceptance of his situation and his growth as a person. The most poignant moment comes when Kelly shows Chuck her wedding ring, and he notices that she still wears the ring he gave her before his departure, not on her ring finger, but on a chain around her neck. This small detail reveals that while she's moved forward with her life, she's never completely let go of their connection. As their conversation continues, Chuck demonstrates the wisdom and acceptance he developed during his years of solitude. He tells Kelly that he's genuinely happy for her, that knowing she found love and built a family brings him peace rather than pain. His words are sincere, reflecting the profound changes in his character. Chuck explains that his time on the island taught him to appreciate the things he could control while accepting the things he couldn't. Kelly's decision to remarry was beyond his influence, and holding resentment or hoping to reclaim their past would be pointless and harmful to everyone involved. Kelly is moved by Chuck's maturity and acceptance, seeing in him a depth and wisdom that wasn't present in the driven executive she once knew. She tells him that while she loves her husband and daughter, she'll always cherish the memory of their relationship and the man he was to her before the crash. Chuck gives Kelly his blessing for her new life, telling her that she made the right choices and that she deserves the happiness she's found. He asks only that she remember him fondly and perhaps occasionally think about the man who survived impossible odds, partly because thoughts of her gave him strength to continue. Their goodbye is tender but final, both of them understanding that this meeting provides closure rather than the beginning of renewed contact. Chuck leaves knowing that Kelly is happy and settled, which allows him to let go of the dreams that sustained him on the island and begin building a new future based on who he's become rather than who he used to be. Before fully closing the chapter on his previous life, Chuck decides to complete one last professional obligation from his time before the crash. Among the packages that washed ashore on the island, there was one that he never opened, treating it with special reverence and keeping it safe throughout his entire survival ordeal. The package is addressed to a ranch in rural Texas, bearing artwork that suggests it contains something personal and meaningful. Chuck drives to the address, treating this delivery as a sacred duty that connects his island experience with the professional dedication that once defined his life. When Chuck arrives at the ranch, he finds that the recipient isn't home, but her property manager or caretaker accepts the package and explains that it was meant for someone who has been waiting for this delivery for years. The artwork on the package, angel wings, apparently has special significance related to the woman's life and work. Chuck doesn't explain his role in the package's delayed delivery, simply completing the transaction as he would have done years earlier as a FedEx employee. The delivery represents the completion of his professional obligations and a symbolic bridge between his old life and whatever comes next. As Chuck prepares to leave the ranch, the caretaker mentions that the property owner will be sorry to have missed him and offers directions to other locations in case Chuck is lost or needs help finding his way. This casual offer of assistance becomes the catalyst for the final scene of Chuck's story. After completing his delivery, Chuck finds himself at a literal crossroads on a quiet Texas highway, with roads leading in 4 different directions. His car is stopped at the intersection, and Chuck sits quietly contemplating the choices that spread out before him like the roads themselves. The crossroads serve as a perfect metaphor for Chuck's situation. He's completed his obligations to his past life, saying goodbye to Kelly, acknowledging the changes at FedEx, delivering the final package. Now he faces the question of what to do with the rest of his life, what direction to take as a man fundamentally changed by his survival experience. Chuck gets out of his car and stands in the middle of the intersection, looking down each road and considering what they might represent. One road leads back toward Memphis and his old life, another toward unknown adventures, others toward different possibilities he can't yet imagine. The choice is entirely his to make. The Texas landscape around him is vast and open, reminiscent in some ways of the ocean that surrounded his island. The sky is enormous, and the horizon stretches endlessly in all directions. Chuck breathes deeply, appreciating the freedom to choose his own direction after years of survival, where his choices were limited to basic life and death decisions. This moment at the crossroads represents Chuck's rebirth as a person who can now consciously choose his path, rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond his control. He's survived the ultimate test of human endurance and emerged as someone capable of building a completely new life based on hard-earned wisdom and inner strength. As Chuck stands contemplating his choices at the crossroads, a pickup truck approaches and stops nearby. The driver is a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, someone who appears comfortable with the rural setting and ready to offer help to a traveler who seems lost. She asks Chuck if he needs directions, noting that the crossroads can be confusing for people unfamiliar with the area. Her manner is friendly and open, representing the kind of human connection that Chuck has been without for so many years. She embodies the possibility of new relationships and experiences in his future. Chuck looks at the woman thoughtfully, seeing in her face not just someone offering practical assistance, but a symbol of the human connections that await him if he chooses to remain open to them. She represents the possibility that his isolation doesn't have to continue, that he can build new relationships based on who he's become rather than who he used to be. The woman's presence at this crucial moment suggests that Chuck's story isn't ending with his rescue and return to civilization, but rather beginning a new chapter. She represents hope, possibility, and the chance for connections that are based on his current self rather than his past identity. As Chuck considers her offer of directions, he seems to understand that this encounter represents a choice point in his new life. He can accept help and human connection, or he can continue the isolation that became such a defining part of his island experience. The woman waits patiently, embodying the grace and possibility of human kindness. Chuck smiles at the woman, and in that smile, we see the emergence of a man who has learned to balance the self-reliance he developed on the island with an openness to the connections and relationships that make life meaningful. He's ready to begin the next phase of his journey, whatever direction it might take. The story concludes with Chuck standing at his crossroads, no longer the time-obsessed executive who boarded a plane years ago, nor exactly the primitive survivor who lived alone on an island, but someone new, a person who understands both solitude and connection, who appreciates both efficiency and patience, who has learned that survival sometimes means letting go of what you've lost and embracing what you might still find. In the gentle Texas breeze, with infinite possibilities stretching out along 4 different roads, Chuck Noland stands ready to choose his future, carrying with him the hard-earned wisdom of a man who has learned that time, while precious, serves us best when we use it to build genuine connections and pursue what truly matters in life. The crossroads wait patiently for his decision, and in that moment of choice, Chuck embodies the hope that even after the greatest losses and most difficult trials, it's always possible to begin again, to find new meaning, and to discover that survival is not just about staying alive, but about remaining open to the beautiful possibilities that each new day might bring. The end. If you are still awake, try our other movie story videos. Subscribe if you liked the video. Thanks.